My mother called me at 11:40 on a Tuesday night, her voice shaking, and asked me to lie to a police officer about something my sister had just done. She didn't know, when she asked, that the person on the other end of that phone call had spent the last 6 years deciding professionally exactly what happens to people who lie to police officers. She didn't know because I'd never told her. For 6 years, my own parents believed I worked in compliance, a word vague enough that nobody ever asked a follow-up question, when in fact I sit on the federal bench in the Eastern District, appointed at 39, the youngest woman in my circuit's history to hold the position. My family didn't know that. What they did know, that Tuesday night, was that my younger sister, Renee, had just struck a 61-year-old man crossing a street outside a strip mall, and that her blood alcohol level, when the ambulance arrived, was going to be a problem. "Just say you were driving," my mother said, her voice dropping into something between a plea and an instruction. "You weren't drinking. Nobody would question it coming from you." Welcome back to Hidden Truth Stories. This is the channel for the moments a family asks you to become someone else entirely, without ever knowing who you actually already are. If a story like this feels uncomfortably close to home, drop a comment and let me know. And before we go further, where are you watching from tonight? Type your city below. I read every single one. My name is Judge Camille Osei. I'm 45 now, though I was 39 the year all of this happened, and I've kept my professional life almost entirely separate from my family, for reasons that will make more sense the further into this story we get. I grew up the older of 2 daughters in a working-class neighborhood outside Cleveland, the daughter who studied at the kitchen table every night while my sister Renee, 4 years younger, filled the house with a different kind of noise entirely. Charm, drama, the particular gravity some people are simply born with that makes a room orbit around them without them ever having to ask. My parents loved us both. I want to be clear about that, because this isn't a story about love being absent. It's a story about love being unevenly distributed in ways nobody in my family ever had the vocabulary to name out loud. Renee struggled. With school, with relationships, eventually with drinking. And every struggle was met, in our house, with a kind of protective urgency that I never once received for my own quieter, less visible difficulties. When I was overwhelmed in law school, working 2 jobs to cover what my scholarship didn't, my mother's advice was to push through, you're the strong one. When Renee was overwhelmed by nearly anything, someone in the family dropped what they were doing. I never resented Renee for this. Not exactly. I resented the machinery around her, the unspoken family agreement that some of us absorbed consequences, and some of us got protected from them. And somewhere in my 20s, without ever fully deciding to, I stopped correcting the assumption that my career was ordinary. When my mother asked what compliance meant, I gave her an answer vague enough to end the conversation. When I was appointed to the bench at 39, an event that made regional news, my parents somehow never saw the article, and I never mentioned it, because by then, the habit of separateness had calcified into something closer to architecture. I told myself I was protecting my privacy. Looking back, I think some part of me was also protecting the version of myself that got to exist entirely outside my family's gravity. The one place Renee's crises couldn't reach. That Tuesday night, they reached anyway. If you've ever quietly kept a major part of your life hidden from your own family, tell me in the comments. What made you decide not to tell them? My mother's voice on the phone was a version of itself I'd rarely heard. Not performing calm the way she usually did during Renee's emergencies, but genuinely, nakedly afraid. She explained it in pieces, the way people do when the story is still assembling itself, even as they tell it. Renee had left a bar around 10:30. She'd been drinking since early afternoon, apparently, after a breakup that had sent her into one of the spirals my family had learned over the years to simply wait out. She'd taken a turn too fast, leaving the strip mall parking lot, and struck a man crossing at the edge of the lot, on foot, headed toward the bus stop. He was alive. He was in surgery for a shattered pelvis and a head injury the paramedics wouldn't yet describe as stable. Renee had called our mother from the scene, sobbing, before the responding officer had even finished his initial assessment. And somewhere in the 11 minutes between that phone call and the officer's first real questions, my mother had already built the entire architecture of a lie, and had called me specifically because I was the only person in the family whose credibility, she assumed, could hold that lie up. "You'd just been visiting her," my mother said. "You borrowed her car for something. You were driving. She was in the passenger seat. She wasn't drinking that much anyway. It's her word against a breathalyzer that might not even hold up. Camille, you're so put together. Nobody's going to question you." I sat in my kitchen, in my actual house, an hour and 40 minutes from the scene of an accident I hadn't witnessed, being asked to insert myself into a criminal investigation as a fabricated witness, by a mother who genuinely did not understand what she was asking, because she genuinely did not understand who I actually was. I want to be honest about the several seconds of silence that followed her request, because I've thought about them more than almost any other moment in my adult life. Some small old part of me, the part that had spent 39 years absorbing the family lesson that Renee's crises came first, considered it. Not seriously, not for long, but the impulse was there, instinctive and immediate. The same impulse that had once made me cover for Renee's missed curfews at 16, her unpaid credit card at 22, her first fender bender at 25. The habit of protecting her had a decade and a half of momentum behind it. What broke that momentum in the end wasn't outrage. It was something quieter and, I think, more honest. I thought about the man in surgery, whose name I didn't yet know, who had done nothing that night except walk toward a bus stop. I thought about every defendant who had ever stood in front of my own bench. Every case built on someone deciding, in a moment of panic, that the truth was negotiable if the right person told it convincingly enough. I had spent 6 years on the other side of exactly this kind of decision, and I understood with total clarity, sitting in my kitchen at midnight, that I could not be the person my mother was asking me to be. Not because of some abstract legal principle, but because I had spent my entire adult life becoming someone incapable of being that person anymore. "Mom," I said, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. I am not going to say I was driving, and I need you to understand why, because it's not what you think. Second question for you. If your family asked you to lie for someone using the exact trust and reputation you'd spent years building somewhere they didn't even know about, what would you have said in that moment?" I told her, right there on the phone, at nearly midnight, something I had kept from my entire family for 6 years. I told her what I actually did. I told her about the appointment, about the oath, about the specific, deliberate weight I carry every single day when I decide what happens to people who've made decisions exactly like the one Renee had made that night, and exactly like the one my mother was now asking me to make on her behalf. The silence on her end was different this time. Not fear anymore. Something closer to disorientation, like she was trying to fit an entirely new person into a space she'd spent 6 years filling with someone else. "You're a judge," she finally said. Not quite a question, not quite a statement. "A federal judge. You never told us." "No," I said. I didn't. Why? I could have given her a dozen half-true answers in that moment. What I gave her instead was the real one. Because I think some part of me knew that if you all found out, it would become one more thing Renee's emergencies had to compete with. And I didn't want my career to become a bargaining chip in whatever crisis came next. Which, I realize now, is exactly what's happening tonight anyway. She didn't have a response to that. I don't think she'd ever considered, even once, that the family's gravitational pull toward Renee might have cost her something she never got to see happening in a real time. I drove to the hospital that night anyway, not as a fabricated witness, but as myself. I sat with my parents in a waiting room while surgeons worked on a man whose name turned out to be Elias Vance, a retired postal worker, 61, out walking that night because his car was in the shop. I met the responding officer briefly, identified myself honestly by title, which visibly changed the tenor of the conversation in ways I found almost unbearably uncomfortable, because I understood immediately that my actual profession carried a kind of institutional weight that could just as easily be misused as my mother had originally intended, if I let it. I didn't let it. I answered the officer's questions honestly, that I hadn't been present, that I'd arrived after the fact, that I had no firsthand knowledge of the incident itself. I told him plainly that my mother had called me earlier that evening and asked me to falsely claim I'd been driving, because I believed, and still believe, that pretending that conversation hadn't happened would have made me exactly as complicit as actually lying would have. My mother did not speak to me for the rest of that night. Renee, when she was finally allowed visitors 2 days later, sober and frightened in a way I'd genuinely never seen from her before, asked me, through tears, why I hadn't just helped her the way I'd always helped her. I told her, as gently as I could manage, that helping her hadn't ever actually meant protecting her from consequences. It had meant delaying them, over and over, for 15 years, until they arrived anyway, larger and more permanent than they would have been the first time. If this story is hitting a nerve, subscribe so the next one finds you. And tell me honestly, would you have told the truth the way I did? Or protected your sister the way your family expected? Renee was charged with driving under the influence and leaving the scene of an accident with injuries, since she'd initially attempted to drive a short distance from the scene before our mother's call redirected her. She ultimately accepted a plea agreement that included a suspended license, mandatory treatment, and restitution to Elias Vance, who survived, though he still walks with a noticeable limp and, from what I understand secondhand, still hasn't fully returned to the independence he had before that night. I recused myself, obviously, from anything even tangentially related to the case, given the family connection, and made sure the presiding judge and prosecutor were both aware of exactly who I was and how I was connected to the defendant. Precisely because I understood, better than almost anyone, how easily a situation like that could quietly bend around someone in my position if I let it. I didn't let it. That was, in the end, the whole point of the 6 years of silence I'd kept about my career in the first place. Not privacy for its own sake, but the ability to remain, if the moment ever demanded it, someone the system couldn't quietly accommodate. My relationship with my family has changed since that night, though not in the direction you might expect. My mother and I had a long, difficult conversation about 3 months later, the first time either of us managed to talk about it without one of us leaving the room. She admitted finally, something I think she'd never let herself examine before, that she'd spent Renee's entire life treating her crises as emergencies and mine as inconveniences, and that somewhere in that pattern, she'd genuinely stopped seeing me as a whole person with a life large enough to hold its own weight, separate from what I could do for everyone else. I told her the truth about my job, fully, in detail, that same conversation. Not as a way of proving something, but because I finally understood that the silence I'd kept for 6 years had cost me more than it had ever protected me. My father, when he finally found out, mostly just asked a lot of questions about the actual job, which was, in its own quiet way, more validating than any apology could have been. Renee and I are still rebuilding something, slowly. She's been sober for over a year now. We don't talk about that night often, but when we do, she's stopped asking why I didn't help her the way I always had, and started asking, instead, what it actually looks like to help someone in a way that doesn't just delay the reckoning they eventually have to face on their own. So tell me honestly, in the comments, Was I wrong to tell the truth even though it meant exposing my sister to real consequences? Or did I finally do the one thing our family had never done for her? Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, and let me know where you're watching from tonight. I still sit on the same bench I sat on before that Tuesday night. But I don't keep the job a secret from my family anymore. It turns out the thing I was actually protecting, all those years, was never my privacy. It was the fear of what might happen if the people I loved most ever had to see me as someone capable of telling them no.